What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of HR Heretics. Today we have a special guest, Didier Elzinga, who is the CEO of CultureAmp. Everybody knows what CultureAmp is who listens to this show. You guys are an employee experience platform. As I was doing my research, though, for the show, I learned that you actually worked in film and most specifically on Harry Potter movies. So, Didier, how do you go from working on Harry Potter movies to being the CEO of CultureAmp?
Nolan, Kelli, I'm delighted to be here. And that's obviously a question I get asked a lot. So, little quick background. I'm a software engineer by training. I fell into a small post-production company. I was employee number 4 or 5. And over 13 years, I was software engineer. I was actually sysadmin, software engineer, artist, CTO, and then CEO. And I ran that company. And I'll come back in a little second about Harry Potter. But I did that for 13 years and loved every bit of it. Incredibly intense work environment, but you're working on Hollywood films. So, it was amazing. But I got to this point where I'm like, I don't know if making the next version of Expendables is really the difference in the world that I want to make. Like, I loved making Hollywood films, but it is a pretty brutal process as well. And so as much as like the image making and the filmmaking, the company part was really hard. A lot of film is driven by tax. And so where films get made, where films get shot, it was very difficult to know what was coming next. And so I'm thinking maybe there's a better thing. And I became good friends with Mike and Scott at Atlassian, watching them build their business. And I'm like, their business model looks way better than my business model. I am a software engineer by background. I built another software company on the side in the film space. And so I'm like, well, I'm young enough to fail. Why don't I try something different? So I stepped out and decided to build a company. And at that time, I didn't know what. I'm like, I want to build a software company. What do I care about? And I kept coming back to people and culture because I realized that was actually the thing that drove me the most at Rising Sun Pictures, which is how do you bring a group of people together and try and do something really difficult and do it in a way that you can be proud of. And so I used to joke and still do joke that as a CEO, you're a glorified psychiatrist. I wanted to build software to help that. And CultureAmp was born. And so that's the mission for us, which is to create a better world of work. And here, almost 13 years later, I'm still here.
That's such a wild journey. I actually haven't heard you really talk about like starting from the bottom at that company. What was the secret to you getting those promotions and then climbing all the way to CEO?
So firstly, to get the job in the first place, I got to see the place. I walked in and they gave me a tour. So I met one of the guys who founded the company at an event and said, "Oh, this is amazing. Can I come and see what you're doing?" So I came in, walked around the whole building. And in one of the rooms, they had a Silicon Graphics computer, if anyone can remember those, that cost about the same as my house. And it was there and it had a little jazz drive next to it for the people that are old enough to remember those. And I said to him, "Oh, you're having trouble getting the jazz drive working on the SGI." It was an indie. And he said, "Yeah, we can't get it to work." And I said, "Well, which version of IRIX are you using?" He said, 5.7, 6.0. I said, "You need to upgrade to 6.1 or it's not going to work." He's like, "Oh, okay." And he calls me up afterwards and he says, "Would you like work as a sysadmin?" And my friend who'd come with me on the trip kind of like, "What was all of that? Like, you don't know anything about those computers." And I'm like, "I don't, but I'd read a news post the day before about the fact that to get a jazz drive working on an indie, God knows why I was reading it. I read it. It was literally the only thing I knew about Silicon Graphics computers. But it was enough to impress him to offer me a role as sysadmin. So the only question I asked was, I said, "Do you have manuals?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "I'm in." So I just figured I would learn. And to be honest, I think along the way, that really was what it was. And I was super lucky that the founders of that company pretty early on realized they didn't want to really run it. And so they trusted me for some reason to do it. So they gave me more and more opportunity. And so I was a CEO really early. We were only a 30-person company when I started running it. And then we landed work on Charlotte's Web, grew to about 150. We were about 250 people when I left. So I learned it all the hard way. And mainly each of those opportunities I was too naive to know that I couldn't. No one else wanted to. And so I put my hand up and said, "I'll try that." And along the way it went.
Yeah. Sometimes the ignorance is bliss, or we're almost fearless because we don't know. Didier, it's so interesting because you started a software company based on people and culture, and I only really know this world, enterprise SaaS tech, for 25 years. I didn't work in film or whatnot, Do they use platforms like CultureAmp? Like, how does that, like, I'm just imagining, right, all these creative people, like, here's, like, it's so interesting. It seems like a chasm to me. And I was just curious on that.
Yeah. Where do I begin? I mean, many of those companies are customers of ours now. So I'm like super happy that I get to work with them. The truth of it is a lot of them don't and didn't. It's a passion. It's very project oriented. So it's kind of crazy in a way, because when we work on a film like Harry Potter, each of them would have somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 man years worth of work, because there's 5, 6, 7 companies with 100 to 1,000 people working on them for a year to 2 years. And to do that, they're basically pulling people from all over the world to come in and work on this project. And so it's very episodic, and you will never have that group of people on that project again. And so the culture that's both a strength and a weakness, because you kind of get to reinvent yourself on every project, but you also want to be clear about what's the through line. But that was part of the reason why I started CultureAmp, was because I started looking around as a CEO going, what are the tools and things that I can apply that will make this easier and make this better? And I was not very impressed. So I was looking at the then software, and we were just, if you go back in time, it was like the rise of SuccessFactors. And, I had my issues with SuccessFactors at the time. I realized that what they were doing, they understood really well what needed in that moment, which was to take something that was offline and take it online. And they weren't trying to improve the process. They weren't trying to fix the process. They were just trying to take it online. And so I was looking at going, I don't like any of this software. This software is all horrible. It's ugly. It doesn't help. I think I can do better. I'm naive. But the key input for me was my wife is a psychologist. My dad is a psychologist. And so I was surrounded by people that had a psych background. And I was looking at it going, there's all this research on how we could be better at work, none of which is available or being applied. And so it was kind of that crucible coming together.
Yes.
But yeah, the film world, some of your listeners will potentially appreciate this and potentially be horrified by it. But there used to be this anonymous poll on the web called VFX Heaven or Hell. And so it was the most horrible thing you've ever seen. So it was basically like a blind, but 15 years ago, and it was only on visual effects companies, and it was horrible. And so people would make these incredible posts like, which person has the most sexist this or whatever, and all of the founders and owners of all of the firms every day would wake up to see what had been said, and it was completely anonymous, so it was just hideous.
Oh my gosh. I thought anonymous AMAs were bad. That's a whole nother level.
Yeah, think about a public industry-wide one.
It honestly brings me back to my CPO days when I would lead off my morning by opening blind, praying to God that something wasn't crazy on that app.
Yeah. So it just tells you the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah. It also tells you that, timing really matters in some of these ideas taking off.
Mm-hmm. I'm very glad that one didn't take off.
All right. I want to talk about, you call it a culture first company. So I was watching one of your talks on this topic, and you said something that really stood out to me. You said, the real test of culture is when things don't go to plan. Why should you invest in your people? Because when things don't work, they will invest in you. And that deeply resonates. I've been at many companies who have gone through significant hardship. You're always thinking as a leader, oh my God, how are people going to respond to this? And it really, what matters is all of the work you've done up to that point and all of the trust that you have instilled in your staff up to that point for them to weather that storm and to have resilience. Can you tell our audience, what do you think are the important ingredients in a culture first company?
I mean, this is obviously the question that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And the very simple, but often powerful things are simple, is just in the name, culture first. It means that you put culture first. And you're like, what does that mean? And something that I've learned as well as I've gone through the journey is that can also be misinterpreted. Culture first doesn't mean culture over everything else. Where you see a tension in a lot of organizations is sometimes people go, if you truly believe in culture, then you're not putting the pressure, or you're not setting the standard, or you're not asking from people as much as you are. And there's a phrase my wife uses, which I really like, which is, a culture first company validates the human being while asking more of the human doing. And it's being able to do a bit of those two things. And so organizations that you would probably say aren't culture first may be amazing because they demand really high things, they have really high standards, they push really hard, but they break people because they literally don't see the person as a fundamentally important component. They don't see the culture as a fundamentally important part. Equally, places that are like, we're just a really nice place to be, we're all good friends, they don't produce great work either. So there is the culture first piece is in the middle. And it's about understanding in the long run, performance is your culture. So a really strong culture comes from high standards and vice versa too. You need to actually set high standards to create a really strong culture. And I learned something there's a NBA player, Shane Battier, who I got to meet at an event. We would spend some time talking, and he spends a lot of time thinking about both culture, but also analytics and data. And he has this thing which he calls a coherency matrix. And so you have on one axis, trust, psychological safety, broad sense of what we would consider to be a good culture. And on the other axis, you have mission orientation and, everybody being focused on achieving an outcome. And similar to what I was saying before, if you are fully focused on achieving an outcome, but there is no trust, it's a miserable place to be and people break. If you are fully focused on creating all the trust, but there's not enough mission orientation, you get a slipping standards where even good people aren't producing at the level they used to produce because not everybody's actually pushing in the same direction. But his insight that really resonated with me is that top right that we all want, where those two things are both in train, is not a stable state. So it's not like some companies do that and they're the great ones and other people don't. It's that you will constantly fall off and you have to figure out how to pull yourself back up. And so for some companies, it's about constantly getting back to mission orientation because you kind of get the trust and the care, not for free, but it's built into the culture. For other companies, it's like you have to keep reminding people that at the end of the day, there are things that matter more than the work. All the mission orientation in the world isn't going to stand up against some of the other things. And so for me, that's what a culture first company is. It's constantly riding that line down the middle and understanding what it means and being very intentional about it. It's not letting culture just happen because culture exists whether you do anything or not. A culture first company is intentional about it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's like these plates are always moving and changing, and there's multiple of them, and they're not static, and they're complex, and they're dynamic. And you talked a bit about this when you talked to Esther, Didier, and Nolan and I have been talking about this with different guests and each other for a while. Is kind of that gap and those expectations, especially with the macro pressure and efficiencies on the employer and the employee and those expectations, which sometimes can get all mixed up in that phenomenon you just mentioned. I mean, what are you all seeing with respect to that gap now in some of your customers or the trends?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing in the data, it's been interesting if you look through the pandemic and then where things got better and then got worse again. So, in many ways, as we came out of the pandemic, if we looked at our data, things got better at work for many people. People were more proud of where they worked. They were more likely to stay. They saw leadership in more favorable ways. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is engagement has started to dip back down. And so it's now back down to 71 on an average basis. It was up to 74 through the pandemic. And you're seeing that across the board. So like pride and motivation is declining. So people are less proud of their companies. They're less motivated for that company. And we expect that's probably going to continue to decline. There's all sorts of complex conversations going on around flexibility and well-being and the balance on those two things. And you're definitely seeing companies cut back on things that they invested in a few years before. And there's a macro piece to this too, but not surprising, we're also seeing employees' confidence in their own companies is dropping too. So across the board, less engagement, more complicated environment. Both sides are looking at it going, I'm not getting what I thought I was getting. Employers or leaders are saying, we don't think people are motivated enough. They're not capable of, well, they don't have resilience isn't the right word, but they're struggling with the ambiguity and they're struggling to operate in this environment. And we need to hire really carefully for a certain type of person. And then employees are going, all the things we were promised haven't come true. And, I'm not getting paid well. I'm not getting the flexibility. All the other things are being asked. So it's going to be an interesting couple of years as we continue to navigate this. And certainly I sit in a whole bunch of CEO channels and I don't know anybody who thinks they're doing a great job right now because everybody's like, this is really hard, like trying to manage everybody's expectations and deliver the results that we need to deliver.
Hey everyone, we'll be right back in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Real talk, most talent leaders haven't yet cracked how to leverage AI for meaningful impact on their hiring processes and business goals. But the leaders who are effectively using AI to transform their recruiting team's efficiency and quality use Metaview. Metaview is the AI assistant for the interview process. Their AI records and transcribes hiring conversations, like intakes, interviews, and debriefs, then provides perfectly summarized notes of everything that was discussed. That means your people can focus on creating human connections with candidates during calls and save time on the busy work of cleaning up notes after every interview. But it's so much more than just a time saver, because perfect notes means perfect data. For every candidate and every pipeline, hiring teams can make confident, informed decisions, and talent leaders can finally take control of the interview process. Join forward-thinking talent leaders at high-performing organizations like Brex, HelloFresh, and Quora, and check out Metaview. Head over to metaview.ai/heretics to talk to one of Metaview's product experts, or get started for free. You'll be up, running, and AI-enabled in minutes.
You just nailed something that I've been thinking a lot about, which is the delta between, call it business reality and employee expectation. And I think in the pandemic, what ended up happening is because everybody was hiring, interest rates were essentially zero. The expectations of employees climbed faster probably than at any other point in time. I don't have data that says that, but intrinsically I feel that, and that's what other CEOs are saying. I'm curious to get your take on where we go from here, because people talk about this pendulum, right? And it's like right now, clearly, like the power is in the hands of the employer, but it seems to me like the next step isn't going to be like, oh, it's going to go back to that. Because I don't think that was normal. I think that was like a blip on the radar. And so what's your take on like what's coming next for the relationship between employers and employees?
Oof, what a great question. The point about expectations, I don't know who said it, but it's always resonated with me. Happiness is reality minus expectations. And like you need to work on both. And so what I think we're seeing at the moment is people are trying to be clearer about the expectations, like this is what you're coming in for. And I think some people are doing it well and are being just much more clear about, look, we're not for everybody. This is how we operate. If this works for you, this will be a great place for you. I think some people are doing it crudely, where they're just like, you don't have a choice. If you want to come here, this is the rules that you have to come work for us. I do think in the medium term, that latter thing won't work, because even though AI is completely changing the game, it's still about amplifying humans. And we need, the value creation. One of the ways I think about it is more and more value creation, economic value creation is intangible. And that intangible basically comes from humans. And so more and more of the value is moved from the hard things like the fixed assets that we have, the cash that we have, the machines that we have, maybe with the exception of the GPUs that NVIDIA owns at the moment. They're probably the most valuable things on the planet right now. But other than that, the value's in people's heads. And so organizations that are successful are the ones that are able to connect with that. And the value creation process is high cognitive load work that needs people to operate in a different way. If you go back to Dan Pink's book, like Drive, and he outlined that really well, high cognitive load work requires a different environment than low cognitive load work. And I think what we're seeing in the conversation at the moment is there's a little bit of this kind of, we should just be able to tell people what to do and then they should just do it. We just need hands. And that's not how economic value is created today. So I do think there's going to have to be an equilibrium. But the bit that I don't have the answer to is, and you probably both see this and talk about this with a lot of other guests as well, is the width of the problems we're trying to solve as leadership now is so high. It's not just about building a great business as much as people would like it to be. There's also social, there's well-being, and I feel like what happened through COVID is we kind of threw a whole bunch of stuff up in the air that, whether it was right or wrong, we were all used to working, like going into the office or, a lot of these things. We're just having to start from scratch again. We don't know. It's going to take 5 or 10 years probably for some new norms to come out that people coalesce around. And my guess is there probably won't be a single norm. There'll be 2 or 3. And then they'll have different types of companies. So it's going to make this podcast fascinating listening for the next decade.
You founded CultureAmp over 15 years ago. Like, I'd love to know, through all the ups and downs, the changes, the chaos, the evolution, what has remained extremely true through it all? Like, what's the data that was true 15 years ago and is just as true today from your perspective?
So one of the key things we look at is engagement, like what drives engagement at work. And, there's a lot of downstream data that shows engagement leads to better outcomes. And the strongest, longest correlation to engagement has always been, this is a place where I can grow in my career. This is a place where I can develop. And so the thing that I feel has never changed is both the need and the importance of growth, like individual growth. Like, how do we make organizations places where people can come and grow? And if we can do that, we create better businesses, we create more economic value, but also people intrinsically get more out of what they need out of work. And I think one of the reasons I started CultureAmp was this realization that, for better or for worse, work is increasingly how we create meaning in our lives. If you go back over time, faith, family, community played larger roles in our own identity. And these days, so much of our identity is trapped up in work. And I'm not arguing that's a good thing. It just is what it is. And so I feel like we have an obligation to create workplaces that give people more positive and more powerful identities. And the key to that is growth. And the data underpins it. You create an environment where people are growing.
And I've been using CultureAmp literally for 15 years. I mean, since the beginning. And I have to ask you, because I have to ask what it's like, and if you all kick the ball around inside the CultureAmp building, so to speak. Like, the growth question was always hard for us, because it would be like, again, you would ask 20 people, what does this question mean to you? What did you think about when you answered it? You'd get 10 different answers. Maybe it would change every other month. How have you all talked about that? Because if I worked at CultureAmp, I'd be like, we got to figure this out, because what does this freaking mean? I mean, have you all talked about that? I've always wanted to ask that.
Oh, yeah, all the time. And it's the same when you have questions that refer to the leaders.
Yeah, yes, the frame of reference.
Which leaders? Do you mean the C level or the VP level? And when you're in one of those groups, you care deeply. But I remember Dr. Jason McPherson, who was our first employee and our chief scientist, and he said something to me once where he said, yes, that's true. And there's validity in sometimes asking more specific questions. But he said, what's happening is often people have their own nebulous concepts too. So someone deep in the organization just thinks of the leaders. They don't necessarily go, this is my specific views on the C level. This is my specific views on VPs. This is my specific, because for them, it's all a melange. And so you're kind of interested in, what are your viewpoints of this kind of amorphous thing that you think is leadership? Acknowledging that what they think of as leadership is totally different to what somebody else does. And so I've, over time, become comfortable with the ambiguity in it, in that all you're trying to tap into is, we know that there's a desire for growth. We know that how people answer that question correlates to things we care about. It tells us directionally whether things are going in the right way or not. But as you would well know, like, the data is, like, a survey is the beginning of a conversation, not the end. And so then it opens up the thing like, well, okay, why is it that no one in our product or feels like they're growing, but people in sales do? Okay, let's go figure that out. And it could be because they think about growth in a totally different way. And it could be because they want structured career ladders, and somewhere else it could be to do something else. But it does bring me to one other thing that is a data point that I've learned over time, which is fascinating to me. And it was, I always used to get annoyed with some of the Gallup questions, like the best friend at work and so on. But specifically the whole thing, that line of, people don't leave companies, they leave managers. And so the reason I get annoyed about it is because people then often put it back onto, the only thing you have to focus on is manager enablement, because if you just fix that, everything else will take care of itself. When you think about growth, and I'll come back with some data on that question. When you think about growth, the direct manager is often not the person that is influencing what your growth opportunities are. Your growth opportunities are usually determined several levels up, because it's about, like, how open are we as a company? How often do we promote? Like, how often do we do lateral hires? What work is being given to your area? And so growth is a leadership responsibility as much as it is a manager responsibility. And so that's kind of how I think about it. And just if I can quickly share some data, on that whole question about leaders and managers, we actually went and looked at it in the data. And so we looked at people that perceive themselves to have a good manager and people that perceive themselves to have a good or a poor leader. So if you have a good manager, but a poor leader, what do you think is the percentage likelihood that you will stay?
60 something.
It's 38. Now, if you have a good leader, but a poor manager, what do you think it is?
60.
Yeah, 60. So it's the exact opposite. It is actually more important for you to trust the leaders in the company than it is to trust your direct leader, direct manager.
Yeah. And I wonder how that correlates to that leader, like doing something about the bad manager, right? The length of time that person can put up with the bad manager, even though they have a great leader.
And do you want to know something even funnier? So if you have both, so, good leader, good managers, 89%, and poor leader, poor managers, 22%. That data was from 2017 when we ran the first analysis. We just reran it to see what happened. So over the 7-year period, the poor leader, good manager has stayed basically the same at 37. The poor manager, good leader has gone up 16 points to 76. So it goes back to what we were talking about, just the difficulty of the world right now and how important leadership is.
So the point on growth deeply resonates with me. And my lived experience is two things that like really come to mind when you talk about it. Is one, I either see leaders who intrinsically understand that there is economic value and business value when they grow their teams, or they don't, and they just immediately start to rely on recruiting and viewing recruiting as like the only lever. The other thing that has resonated with me, or that I've seen, somebody said this in a reference call to me one time. It was talking to somebody. I was trying to hire somebody who was like a director level, and I didn't understand why they never got to VP. And the person I talked to was their manager, who was no longer at the company. He said something. He goes, "Nolan, have you ever been at like a family reunion and you see your uncle, and like your uncle's like, oh, it's little Nolan, and you're like, I'm a grown man, I'm not 5 anymore. I'm 35. Like, what are we talking about?" And he goes, that's what happened to this person at this company. And ever since he said that to me, I don't know what type of a bias it is. I know it's a human bias because we anchor based off of like our first impression on somebody. You have customers that span the gamut, right? Of like, hey, they deeply understand it or they don't. I'm assuming like the best way to influence everybody is like by bringing this data to the table. But like, there's got to be some like deeper insights here as you've done this for 13 years. Like, what are you learning on how to influence these people who don't intrinsically understand it?
Oh, wow. There's so many things in that I want to pick up on. So on the very last point, I get asked all the time, how do I convince people to do this if they don't believe in it? And my somewhat heretical answer is don't bother. Like, enough people get it that it's not worth wasting your time trying to convince the people that don't. Like, honestly, just go find some people to do and go work with them. So that's kind of a cute answer, but it's part of how I think about it. But when we think about the data side of it and what we can bring to bear, what I'm actually really excited about is we're just starting to see enough data that we can draw some really interesting conclusions. And they aren't always the things that we want to see or want to hear. So the growth thing is important. I can't yet on our own data show some of the things I want to show. If you look at the difference between genders on how they feel on a whole bunch of different bits and pieces, having next to no difference is an incredibly strong predictor of share price performance. So companies where you have a significant difference in perceptions between men and women on a range of different factors indicates that they will have lower share price over a long period of time. We did our own bit of data showing the impact of implementing a structured performance review. Now, obviously, we want you to do it on CultureAmp, but it doesn't have to be done on CultureAmp. And what we showed was that on a range of factors, we were hoping to see a bunch of stuff that didn't come. But what we did see was that on a range of factors, for men, it made no difference to their perception on my role is evaluated fairly, work is handed out properly, I have opportunities for growth and development, important factors on somebody's view. But for women, it eradicated the historical gap. So there was about a 10 percentage point gap between the men and women when you looked across all of our customers. And after they implemented a structured performance review process, that shrunk to about 2 percentage points. That's huge. Now, does that tell me that those companies will be better businesses? Now that I've got the irrational capital data, it does. But even back then, I'm like, that's reason enough to do it. So I think the good thing is we are now getting the data where we can help people understand, here's what the data tells you is likely to happen if you do this thing. On the director VP thing, though, this is a conversation I've had many times and I think about a lot, and I imagine you probably both have opinions on it too. I think the whole problem with director to VP is a different role than a director. And it's almost this curse that people think that if you're a director, the next step is to be a VP. And I think that is only true for 10 or 20% of the people, not because it's just a different role. And so like you may or may not be well suited to being that person. I think there are people that would be phenomenal directors who should never be VPs. Anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. And part of growth is linear.
I think it's really well said on the director to VP comment. And I'm just reflecting back to that case when I heard it for that person. I think that's exactly what was going on there. But I do think that there are other aspects that you hit on. So specifically, like, go work with other people, right? Who people that don't get it. I hadn't thought of it that way, because you always like, oh, well, I want to influence and I want to bring data to the table. And, I think about this now being a dad, and my daughter, who is a total rebel. She's 5 and she like basically runs the world. And that little girl has to learn the hard way. And I think it's true that for a subset of people, and they tend to be in leadership roles, that oftentimes like the way that they have to learn is getting burned by the stove. It sucks. It sucks that it has to be that way, but it seems like that is it's just true in humanity and dealing with humans.
Yeah, I think what we can do is we can bring data to try and debunk myths, and people will say things and you're like, wait a second, that actually doesn't make sense. Or that doesn't add up. Let's look at that. Let's look at the data and see if that's true. And I think that's where we can be helpful, and we can help managers understand that. Like, we did some work years ago, actually with Salesforce, and we were looking at their teams and looking at sales managers and people in their teams and engagement. And we did some analysis, and we were able to show that the strongest correlation for performance of that team and quota achievement was whether or not the people in the team perceived their sales manager to believe that people were important. And that was incredibly powerful data, because it allowed the people team to go to all of their sales leaders who didn't want to come to any of the training, didn't want to do any of those things, and go, hey, I know you don't want to be here, but I just wanted to point out to you that the people that make more money than you, this is what they do. Now you have people's attention.
Yeah, and tying the data to the earlier findings to share price and whatnot. I think that is something that we've been talking about a lot, is tying this work to the top and bottom line of the company, which wasn't always there. It was always a factor. It's just the line through wasn't always drawn. And I love how that's starting. And to my earlier question, Didier, on, the growth question, for example, I love what you said around the data is like the start of this. I just want to accent that, because I've been a part of so many companies where, oh my God, they'll take the 1,000-person report and go away, alone behind the curtain, dissect it and do all these perfect hypotheses, and they don't talk to anyone. And it's like, listen, the data can take you so far. Let's not do this unless we're actually going to get underneath it and have these honest conversations, which is in my experience, the most important and hardest part of this process, and the one that's usually least followed.
Yeah. And you talked about Esther before, and we've been fortunate. She's a special advisor to us, and we've had an opportunity to do a whole bunch of work. And I actually caught up with her in New York a few weeks ago. And I mean, she's the most amazing woman on the planet. Like, every time I speak to her, I just learn something. And her ability to get into that tension and that paradox. And, we had this great conversation where we were talking about, I think, go back to expectations. Sometimes people just have unrealistic expectations too. Like you got to sit down and say, no, you're not going to be a director after 3 months here. No, you're going to have to work harder. You're not good enough. You're not nearly where it needs to be. And there's a lot of organizations and a lot of leaders and managers that don't know how to have that conversation. And that was her point, which I asked her, we're talking about empathy and accountability. And I said, what do you think is the biggest challenge today for leaders? And she said, I think we have a generation of leaders that don't know how to embody accountability. And I was expecting her to go into the empathy side because she's so good at teaching people how to think about that. And she went on and she talked about it's to do with parenting, it's to do with all sorts of bits and pieces. She said, like, if you have a child, you have your 5-year-old and they want a chocolate donut and you don't think they should have one because it's not healthy or whatever, it's your job to say no and it's their job to be upset about it. And I'm like, actually really love that. And she said, but in organizations, we're not very good at that. We're not good at being able to do that part. At the same time, you still have to be able to create that space. And I think what's so powerful about like an engagement survey or something is it's a way of creating space to have a conversation that you're obviously not having. And then the data helps you realize we're not having this conversation that we really need to be having. Now you have to go to humans and you have to actually learn to listen.
Yeah, not we, I'll speak for myself. I've seen the cynicism over the years, like engagement surveys. It's like, well, you're cynical because you're not actually doing the friggin' work that's moving it. Like the survey is not the answer alone.
That's actually a learning for me. That's actually one of my core learnings of like, I remember using CultureAmp. I'm a first-time CPO. I'm like, let's go get CultureAmp. Like, let's go deploy this. And then we hear a bunch of shit from employees that I was completely unprepared for. Then what I did, I think this is where I made the critical mistake, is I tried to build the people roadmap to address all of the concerns of the employees versus taking a step back and saying like, okay, this is what we're hearing from our employees. What do we stand for? Like, what does this company stand for and where do we want to be going? Because clearly we have not communicated that well enough for people to choose to either opt in and join and be on the bus or to opt out with their feet and go somewhere else. And I think that experience made me a detractor of engagement surveys. But I think it was actually like my execution after the survey was in and letting employees basically run the people team roadmap.
100%. I'm so glad you said it that way because it in a perfect world, you have a strategy. Like that's why you're the CPO. You pull together all these things and it's a signal that you go, these bits of my strategy are working and make sense. This doesn't tally. Either I'm not executing or maybe my strategy is not the right part of the strategy here or whatever, but like it's an input, but it shouldn't set your strategy. It should feed into it. And Anna Binder, who's on my board, she's the CPO at Asana, and she has a great quote, which I love. And we routinely send it to each other when we're doing engagement surveys, our own internal ones. And it is, feedback is not a gift. It is a workout. Like that's the mental model. That when you're reading however many thousand comments, and even if you're using AI to help you summarize them and get sense out of it, it's this idea that like feedback is like a menu in a restaurant. If you walked in and ate everything on the menu, you would feel terribly sick. So you kind of look through the menu and you go, today I'm going to eat the fish and I'm going to have the vanilla slice. And I'm going to do something about those two things. I'm going to feel good and I'm going to have a great time and I'm going to recommend the restaurant. But yeah, if you try and eat the whole menu, oh my God.
Yeah. Didier, you've been doing this for so many of us, over the years. Like, how do you run CultureAmp? What have been your non-negotiables over the past 15 years? How did you protect that through scale? Like, what's your deal? What do you stand for and kind of, fall on the sword for?
Yeah. I love, it's such a continuing education in all of that. Cause we're 1,000 people now, just under. The values are at the heart of everything. So our first value is have the courage to be vulnerable. And that's been a really big learning point. So both in the positive affirmation of that, in terms of what does it mean to actually create space where you can be that and create an environment where people do that, but also realizing that, to quote Brene Brown, vulnerability without boundaries is manipulation. And so, it's not just unfettered vulnerability. It's not somebody coming in and dumping on their manager issues they have at home that manager is not equipped to deal with. That's not vulnerability. But vulnerability is about creating a space where you get to be more of yourself. You get to fail. You get to not try and pretend that you're always right. And that leans into growth. So for me, having the courage to be vulnerable is the first part of growth. We have learn faster through feedback. Trust people to own decisions and amplify others. Trust people to own decisions is the hardest value for us because everybody reads it as an autonomy value, whereas it's actually an accountability value. And so there's a whole dialogue on that. The things that have always been true for me, it goes back to this growth thing. Like one of the lines that I use a lot is if we're thinking about someone internal versus an external candidate, the way I like to think about it is where do we think that internal candidate will be 6 months from now? That's the person we should be evaluating with the person we're trying to hire. Because it's going to take time for us to hire that person. It's going to take time for that person to come on board. And in a way, we want to bet on that momentum and that potential. We want to look at this person and go, in 6 months, this person could do the job. And so I think if in 6 months the person can do the job, you should go with the person internal. Like I want CultureAmp to be a place where you do, on the whole, not everybody, but on the whole, you do at least 2 steps. Because otherwise we're kind of wasting that potential. But something I had to kind of come to was when I thought about growth early on, I had a conversation, we were a couple of hundred people, and we were talking about commitment to growth. And then somebody said, yeah, but not everybody wants to be growing in their role. Sometimes people are just quite happy where they're at, and for their own life, there's other things that are more important to them than work and stuff. And so we shouldn't always be striving for that. And I thought, that's very true. And I agree with that. But then as the years went by, I went, actually, we can't be that company for both of those people. If we want to be a company where people are really going to grow and have an opportunity to grow, then we have to be committed to that all through. And we just have to say to people, it's not like you're not going to get to stay here if you plateau. Like everybody plateaus. But you shouldn't come to CultureAmp if you just want a job that's second place to other things in your life. Like I always say to people, we borrow our time at work from people or things much more important than the work is. Even if you're a workaholic, and I am, and it's fundamentally important to have that. And I never want any work to ever come before someone's family or health. But I've had to learn that for us to be the company we want to be, to build the product we want to be what we want to be for people that are coming here, we also have to be willing to say we can't be everything for everyone. This is going to be a hard place. It's going to be tiring. It's going to be challenging, but you will grow. And that's the commitment that we're going to make. So that's the thing that I've kind of doubled down on as we've grown. And then the last thing is, I knew it coming out of Hollywood. I've had it hammered into me in CultureAmp, and it's the thing I believe to my core is that storytelling is the most important skill as a leader. And so how do we teach leaders and managers how to tell stories? Because I think that's the biggest skill that they need to be able to be effective.
So funny. I mean, one of my good friends, Rima Singh, is the head of people over at Pixar, which ironically is another, filmmaking. And I had coffee with her recently, and she's like, it just gets hammered into us from day one. It's storytelling. So maybe it's the film. I don't know what it is, but that just connected for me.
My old boss, Henry Ward, CEO Carta, one of the best things he ever gave me was the presentation skills of Steve Jobs. Which like took me down this rabbit hole of like, holy shit, like there's an art to this thing. So Didier, I totally agree. And I've now become like so obsessed with learning how great storytellers do it and breaking it down to like its essence, because it has such a powerful impact on humans. How are you doing that with your employees and with your managers?
I mean, obviously you give training and support and you create that forum, but there's 2 parts to it. The first part is the skill. And you can learn that, like in learning how to tell stories, and there's lots of resources out there. The other part, and this is where the first value is so important, is the thing you learn in Hollywood is there are only a few kind of key stories. So the hero with 1,000 faces, all of the kind of comparative mythology stuff. And one of the most powerful stories is the origin story. Where did I come from? And so often when I'm working with somebody, it'll be like, what's your story? Like you may not have the refined presentation skills, but you can tell an authentic story that nobody else can tell. And so if I go back to the early days of CultureAmp, Ed Swee was one of our first salespeople in the US. And we'd got to know him at Chase. He was working at Chase, and he'd actually been helping us as we set up all our accounts. And then he'd gone to SuccessFactors, and he applied for a job at CultureAmp, and we ended up hiring him as one of our early sales guys. And so my story, when I'm telling the CultureAmp stories, I used to work in Hollywood, and I was a CEO, and blah, blah, blah. And so he would tell a version of my story. And I said to him, that's my story. You should come up with your own. And so the story that we came up with, which he would use, is he would go sit across the table from a CPO, and he would say, I've been at CultureAmp now for 6 months, but before CultureAmp, I was the person you used to send those surveys to. I worked at Chase. I worked at SuccessFactors. I worked in these companies, and I would get these things. And this is what I wanted you to hear. And this is how I wanted you to listen to me. And which is why I'm now here. And so it's that, you just help people understand why are they here and how can they connect in an authentic way to the people around them.
And I bet he closed a lot of deals.
He was very good. He was a very good sales guy.
Didier, we've been doing this now for almost 16, 18 months. And this is one of my favorite conversations so far. Thank you so much for the time. This was a blast.
Oh, thank you for having me. You had me at the podcast title, HR Heretic. I love it. It's I think that's the thing we have to do more than anything is just keep fighting the good fight and saying to people, the way you've been told it should work may not be the way. And the way that you feel in your heart might be, and we can help you.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much, Didier. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
HR Heretics is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Econ 102, Moment is Zen, and Turpentine VC. Subscribe, 5 stars, share it on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, all the things.
Hey everyone, Eric here. Ever wondered how the biggest names in tech turn pricing into their secret weapon for explosive growth? Well, I've got a new show for you that pulls back the curtain on the real levers of SaaS pricing. It's called Unpack Pricing, hosted by Scott Woody, who is the co-founder and CEO of Metronome, a usage-based billing platform powering billing for OpenAI, Anthropic, and Databricks. In each episode, Scott sits down with founders, executives, and pricing experts to break down how they use pricing to grow their business and drive revenue growth. You'll hear from founders like Spencer Kimball of Cockroach Labs on the realities of monetizing open source software, and from product and pricing leaders like Jesse Miller on navigating both product-led and sales-led growth. Whether you're a startup founder, product leader, or trying to acquire an edge in your understanding of tech business models, Unpack Pricing delivers insights you won't find anywhere else. Subscribe to Unpack Pricing, available wherever you get your podcasts. Head to the link in the show notes now.